Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
Are you ready for a shocking truth that will probably annoy the kind of people who love microphones more than results? Because the quiet one at the table, the one who looks like she is letting the moment pass, is usually the person holding the only paperwork that matters. And can you guess what happened next when my family showed up to seize what they had already decided was theirs and found out that the locks, along with the story they told themselves, had already changed? At my sister's graduation party, where the applause bounced around like a rubber ball someone refused to pick up, she lifted her glass and said my dropout brother should just hand her his failed business so a real adult could fix it. And my dad nodded as if she had solved a hard problem in front of a class, while I kept my face calm and my mouth shut because I have learned that winning in public requires months of boring preparation in private, and I had done that preparation down to the line. Items no one bothers to read. I watched my brother stare into the safe place people make when shame tries to crawl up their throat, and I did not rush to defend him because pity is gasoline on the fire of a bully's performance, and what he needed was not a speech but a structure, which I had already built piece by piece during the weeks when he was chasing late invoices and swallowing another landlord threat, and I was quietly converting chaos into leverage that would not ask anyone's permission. Months earlier I gave him what I called a bridge loan, but what was really a promise to shield him if he fell, a clean and boring note secured by very specific assets, the inventory stacked on shelves, the equipment that hums when the shop breathes, and the brand and customer lists that are the only real gold in a place like ours, and I filed the financing statement with the same care I used to label a cable in a dark cabinet, not because anyone would clap, but because someday someone would try me. And I intended to be ready. I met the landlord, a woman who has seen more family dramas than any therapist and hates them all, and I did not spin a tale about talent misunderstood. I handed her the rent history, the cash projections, and the clause I needed. A simple assignment provision that triggered if payments slipped twice, and she agreed because certainty is a better romance than charm, and because I showed her that keeping my brother's shop alive would keep her row of units stable through the slow season. I paid the website domain, the company email, and the merchant software from my own account, not because I wanted credit, but because control lives wherever subscriptions renew. And I moved all of it into a password manager with dual authentication, so that on the day someone decided to stage a takeover for the camera would find a door that no longer recognized their touch. So when my sister said that line and the room did its little gasp, I did not argue or correct or plead. I asked the server for water, I told a cousin a dumb joke about cake and ambition, and I watched my dad lean back the way he does when he imagines he is the board and the judge and the market all at once. While in my head, I walked through the checklist that would turn their performance into a footnote. After the party, I drove to the unit where the air always smells like ink and effort, and I found our bookkeeper waiting with reconciliations and a stack of ready forms, and our floor lead lining up finished orders with the kind of pride that does not post. And together we did the quiet work that makes a morning impossible to hijack, closing the register, moving payroll to the new entity we had set up weeks ago, redirecting the merchant account with pre-approved credentials, exporting the client list with signed permissions, and confirming with our two most critical vendors that the terms had already been novate to my company and would not wobble if someone banged on the glass tomorrow. Near midnight, the locksmith arrived because the landlord, who respects schedules, had signed the authorization, and I watched the old cylinders slide out with a soft clink while a printed notice went up on the door that used simple words and no heat, secured party in possession. Contact this email. Business continues under existing contracts, and I set 3 sets of keys on the counter, one for me, one for the floor lead, and one for my brother, because dignity is not a speech, it is the weight of a key in a tired hand. I sent my father a single message, not a negotiation but a courtesy, that I would handle the shop transition and that arriving with cameras or threats would not help. And then I set my phone face down because I am done letting other people's urgency draft me into their theater, and I finished labeling shelves, backing up files, and printing a 1-page FAQ that answered the only questions customers actually ask: are you open? Will my order ship? And who am I paying now? I slept for a Short block of hours with the kind of sleep that follows a long plan clicking into place, and when I woke I found confirmations from vendors, a lease assignment email from the landlord, and a payroll transfer receipt that meant people would get paid on time. And I held those new keys at my kitchen table and let myself feel a clean version of anger that is not rage and not revenge but alignment, the feeling you get when a boundary stops being an idea and becomes a door that locks. I drove to the unit before opening and stood behind the counter while the morning light made the notice easy to read, and I pictured my sister arriving with her boxes and her pitch, and my dad with his voice that tries to bulldoze doubt. And I did not rehearse comebacks or write speeches in my head. I breathed and listened to the presses warming up and thought about how loudly a closed lock speaks to people who think the world opens for them, and I promised myself that when they came, I would not explain more than the law requires. I would not match their volume, and I would give them one chance to act like adults, and if they refused, I would let the process move the conversation where performance cannot follow. As I flipped the sign to open, my phone lit with my father's name and a message that said they were on their way and to open the door, and I felt the old reflex to answer quick and smooth die in my chest, and I put the phone back down without replying. Because the hook of this whole story is simple, the person who stayed quiet at the table last night is the one who changed the locks, and the next thing you need to know is what happens when people who mistake volume for power grab a handle that does not turn. When they pulled up in front of the unit the next morning, they carried themselves like they were about to stage a corporate takeover. And I could see immediately that they had rehearsed their roles on the drive over, because my father stepped out of the car with his chest forward. My sister followed in a blazer that looked like she thought cameras were waiting, and a cousin trailed them with his phone angled just right, hoping to capture the moment for whatever little online victory they imagined they would score. But the moment cracked the second my father yanked on the handle and found it locked, his face shifting through disbelief and irritation while he tried again, as if sheer insistence could undo the steel cylinder that had already been replaced by the locksmith only hours earlier. The printed notice stared back at him in plain language that was both dull and devastating: secured party in possession, operations continuing under new management, inquiries to this email, and, though it had no exclamation marks or dramatic fonts, it said everything that needed to be said, and he read it twice before slapping the glass like a man trying to intimidate an inanimate object. I stepped outside then, not to make a show but to prevent him from making one, and I said good morning in a voice that carried enough steadiness to suggest I was not negotiating, only clarifying. My father puffed up, his volume rising in the way it always does when he wants people to forget the lack of substance behind his demands, and he announced that they were there to take control of the business, to save it from collapse, and to place it in the capable hands of my sister who, according to him, had just proven at her graduation party that she was ready for real leadership. My sister smirked, waiting for me to fold, and the cousin with the phone tried to edge closer, hoping for tears or outrage, but I simply stood there with my hands in my pockets, reminding myself that contracts are louder than any speech once the door does not budge. I explained, with a calmness that seemed to irritate him more than if I had shouted, that the shop was under secured party possession, that the lease had been assigned to my company pursuant to the agreement signed months ago, that payroll had already cleared, orders were already processed, and staff were already under retention packages, and that any attempt to interfere with operations would not only fail, but create legal exposure they did not want to test. My father scoffed, calling me dramatic, while my sister stepped forward, trying to force the confrontation into optics she could use, and she asked if I had really gone so far as to change the locks on Evan's shop. I told her plainly that yes, I had, and that it was not his shop anymore in the way she imagined, because when he signed the secured agreement with me, he gave me control precisely for this moment, to protect him from the humiliation of being stripped in public by the people who claimed to love him while secretly treating him as a prop in their own storyline. For a second her smile faltered, the way it does when someone realizes the test was scheduled months before they studied, but then she waved at the cousin to keep filming and announced that the internet would judge who was in the right, as if likes and shares could rewire a filed financing statement. I told her she was welcome to the court of public opinion, but that the only court that mattered had already ruled the moment the locks turned smoothly for me and not for her. My father, unwilling to concede, banged the glass harder, ignoring the small group of dog walkers who had stopped to watch, and shouted that he would not be treated like an intruder by his own children, that he had built the foundation of our family's name, and that it was his right to decide who carried it forward. But his words bounced off the door like a fist against a safe, making more noise than impact. I offered them one quiet chance to talk like adults in the conference room that the landlord had set aside for disputes, reminding them that cameras would not be allowed, that the only language spoken there would be paperwork, and that they might prefer to sit down with actual terms instead of continuing to perform for strangers on a sidewalk. My sister snapped that she would sue me, that she would take the name, the clients, and the lease, and that she would make sure everyone knew what kind of person I had become, and I told her that she might want to check her inbox before making threats she could not back up. She looked confused, then pulled out her phone despite my father telling her not to, and her face hardened when she saw the emails I had sent only an hour earlier, a cease and desist letter, a notice of secured party possession, a confirmation of the lease assignment, and a vendor list showing every supplier already affirming that operations continued under my company. My father tried to wave it away, claiming documents could be faked, but the staff standing behind me, tired of years of his speeches, knew otherwise, and even the cousin lowered his phone slightly as if the footage had already lost its sting. My father stepped closer, dropping his voice into the tone he used to use when I was 15 and too eager to please, telling me that I was making an enemy I could not afford, that I was turning family into adversaries, and that no one wins when bloodline fractures, but I told him calmly that I was not making enemies, only boundaries, and that if he continued to interfere when the shop opened in 15 minutes, I would ask security to remove him. For a long moment he stared at me as if searching for the daughter who used to cave at the first sign of disapproval, but she was gone, replaced by a woman holding the only keys that mattered. And eventually he turned on his heel and dragged my cousin back toward the car. My sister lingered a second longer, whispering that I was dead to her, that she would never forgive what I had done, and I told her I hoped she still found a way to celebrate her day because spite does not build a company and anger does not pay a vendor. She left with her chin high, and just as I flipped the sign to open, a police cruiser rolled slowly into the lot, the officer stepping out to say he had received a call about a disturbance, and I looked at the locked door, at the notice on the glass, and at the family retreating to their car, and I told him that everything depended on how much he liked reading, because the answer to every question he might ask was already in my folder, ready to turn noise into silence. One page at a time. The officer who stepped out of the cruiser could not have been more than 30, his uniform neat and his expression carrying that blend of caution and detachment that only comes from dealing with too many family disputes in small commercial parking lots. And he asked me, in a voice calm enough to cut through the tension, if I could explain what exactly was going on, which was my invitation to lay out the story not in speeches or insults, but in documents, so I reached into the folder I had prepared, the one I always carry in the front pocket because my grandmother once told me that if something matters you never let it live only in memory, and I handed him the security agreement signed months earlier, the financing statement filed with the state, and the landlord's written consent assigning the lease to my LLC if conditions triggered, all neat, dated, and boringly official, while my father hovered close, alternating between outrage and charm, insisting that this was a family matter and did not require police interference, though his tone carried exactly the edge of desperation that comes when volume finally meets the wall of a process that does not bend to raised voices. The officer, professional and slow, read each page out loud under his breath, his lips moving a little as he traced the words. And then he looked up at me and asked a few questions that were sharp enough to show he understood the difference between bluster and binding agreements, and when I answered with clarity, he nodded, tucked the papers back into the folder, and turned to my father with a polite but final tone, saying that unless he had his own documents establishing control, which of course he did not, He had no standing to be there and needed to leave so that the business could continue its operations without disturbance. My father tried to pivot, trying to paint me as manipulative, suggesting I had tricked Evan into signing something he did not understand. But the officer shut that down with a simple request. Did he have evidence to back that claim? Because without evidence, it was nothing more than an allegation that did not change possession or rights. And when my father admitted he had no paperwork, only his word, the officer repeated that it was time to leave. My sister, however, was not ready to let go, and she stepped forward with that particular fire that belongs to people who think indignation can rewrite the rules of the world, declaring that she would sue me, that she would take the name, the clients, and the entire book of business because it was her birthright, because family equity cannot be erased by signatures, and she said all of this while her cousin filmed, though the officer interrupted, reminding her that while she was free to pursue any legal claim, she could not disrupt active business operations, and that if she refused to step back, he would have no choice but to record her refusal as trespassing, which would not look as glamorous on social media as she imagined. The cousin hesitated, then lowered his phone halfway, muttering about free speech, but the officer told him he could film all he wanted from the public sidewalk, not on private property where a notice of possession was already in place, and reluctantly he retreated, dragging my sister with him while she glared at me with the intensity of someone who still believed she could burn me down with pure willpower. When their car finally pulled away, the lot felt like a theater after the curtain had dropped, quiet except for the hum of the presses inside, and my phone buzzed with a new email. This one an auto-reply from a lawyer's office with the subject line, "Our claim." Clearly the beginning of the storm my sister had promised in front of the door, and I smiled without humor, forwarding it to my own attorney with the subject, "Noise as expected," because I had anticipated exactly this move, which is why the cease and desist letters and vendor confirmations had already gone out earlier that morning. I went back inside, checked the register, and found Rosa and Quinn waiting with steady faces, both of them clearly shaken by the spectacle, but also relieved that the officer had walked away convinced by paper, not volume. And I reminded them that our orders mattered more than our arguments, that if we shipped clean and on time, clients would ignore whatever online noise my sister tried to stir up. Evan arrived around noon, his shoulders tense and his eyes darting like a man expecting to be scolded, and when I brought him into the small office and shut the door, he blurted out that he thought I was angry with him, that I had changed the locks because I was tired of cleaning up his mistakes, and I told him no, I had changed the locks because I had promised him months ago that if he ever reached the point where people circled like vultures, I would step in and take control so he could step back with dignity, and I slid the new key across the desk, explaining that he had a choice. He could either walk away with 3 months of salary and a clean exit, or he could stay on as operations director under my terms, no longer subject to Dad's constant undermining or Lena's appetite for optics, but judged on his actual ability to deliver, and he sat there in silence for a long time, staring at the key as though it were heavier than metal, and finally said he wanted to stay, but only if I promised that this would not be another trap, another family scheme where loyalty got twisted into humiliation. I told him that was exactly why I had done this, not to trap him but to free him, that family rules had never protected him, only punished him, and that from this day forward we would operate like professionals, with contracts, milestones, and expectations, not with guilt and favoritism. He signed the simple one-page agreement I had drafted, his name shaky but firm, and for the first time in months, he laughed, a sharp sound that carried both relief and disbelief, and said they were going to hate me for this, and I told him they already did, which made us free to finally build without their interference. By late afternoon, my father's lawyer called, professional and clipped, requesting a meeting the next day in the landlord's neutral conference room, and I agreed because it was always better to funnel the fight into paperwork rather than the sidewalk. That evening, as I finally sat down to breathe, another email arrived, this one a photo texted by my mother, showing a certified letter she had received addressed to my father, herself, and me, with a caption asking, "What is this?" And I knew immediately what it was before she even opened it, because the accountant who had managed the family's educational fund years ago had hinted to me recently that he was closing old files, and the letter confirmed it. A clean timeline of how money meant for. My college had been pulled years earlier into one of my father's failed ventures, leaving me to build my career without the support he had promised, and though I had long since made peace with that loss, the letter arriving on this day, at this moment, was almost too precise to be coincidence. I leaned back in my chair, realizing that tomorrow's meeting would not only be about Evan's shop, but about the unspoken debts and betrayals that had been swept under the rug for years, and for the first time I felt the weight shift entirely, not because I had won already, but because the truth was starting to speak in its own voice, louder than my father's, louder than my sister's, and impossible to drown out. By the time the sun had made it past the edge of the industrial roofs and pushed a weak stripe of light across our loading bay, I had already drafted, edited, and sent a statement that would never trend, would never rack up comments about drama or betrayal, and would never feed the spectacle my sister craved, because it was exactly one page of dry clarity written in the same tone you use when you tell a delivery driver which door is unlocked, and it said that the company was operating under a secured party possession executed months earlier, that payroll had run and orders would ship on schedule, that staff had chosen to stay under small retention bonuses through the end of summer, and that any questions could be sent to a single address that Quinn would monitor with the patience of a chess player who cares more about the next 3 moves than the current one, and, while I knew it would not win hearts, it would do the only thing that matters when the internet tries to pull you into a brawl, which is to reassure the people who actually pay the invoices that nothing they depend on is about to wobble. Within the hour, 2 anchor clients responded with the kind of short grown-up gratitude that never gets screenshots, one thanking me for specifics and another writing that they pick the adults in the room. And I forwarded those lines to Rosa because nothing steadies a shop like proof that the work speaks louder than the noise at the door, and she replied with a photo of the morning run lined like soldiers on the drying rack and a note that said she had already scheduled preventative maintenance for the press that had been groaning for weeks, which was the sort of sentence that feels like oxygen when you are building a future brick by brick. Meanwhile, my sister, who cannot abide a day without applause, posted a bright video built around accusations that refused to name me but clearly pointed at the only person who changed the locks, performing indignation about family theft and hinting at legal thunder that was supposedly rolling in from the horizon. And although the comments filled with the predictable chorus of friends from school and people who love the smell of scandal, the calls that landed on my phone were from vendors who asked one question and only one, whether we were stable, and to each of them I answered with the same unglamorous list, that we had cash coverage for the month, that our line of credit was untouched, that lead times were intact, and that the only changes they would notice were invoices arriving on a new letterhead and deliveries signed by the same hands as last week, which is the dialect of competence most people secretly crave, even if they sometimes act like a fire is more interesting than a building that does not burn. At noon I walked to the landlord's conference room for the meeting my father's lawyer had requested, and I braced for theatrics, because old habits die hard. Yet the man who greeted me was measured rather than combative, laid his folder on the table, and after a few crisp questions acknowledged what he could not change, that the filings were in order, that possession was clean, that operations were continuing, and that his client's insistence on family prerogative was not a legal category the lease recognized, which would have been satisfying if satisfaction were my sport, but it is not. So I simply outlined the guardrails I intended to keep in place: no cameras on the shop floor, no use of client lists by unauthorized parties, and no claims made in public that misrepresented who controlled what. And he nodded in the weary way of a man who knows a storm has passed over his calendar and left only paperwork behind. Back at the unit, the day unfolded with a pragmatic rhythm that felt like relief dressed as routine: orders checked, boxes sealed, labels printed, and between each task Quinn and I fielded emails about reputation rather than law. Which is how these things always work once the legal dust settles, because people who were impressed with my sister's graduation night performance had begun to realize that indignation does not pack shipments, and that leadership measured in likes rarely survives the moment a customer wants a corrected size by Friday, and the shift was visible even online where some of her own supporters asked small questions that cut deep, like who was on payroll, who owned the lease, and who could sign checks without asking permission. Sometime near late afternoon, my father tried a different move that would have worked a year ago, walking into a branch to redirect funds from the old account into a separate one he controlled, only to be told by a bank officer who must live on caffeine and policy manuals that his name was no longer an authorized signer and that the entity attached to the account had changed, which led to a voicemail he left for me in the parking lot stuffed with wounded pride and phrases about respect and legacy and daughters who forget where they came from, and although part of me still flinches at the sound of that voice turning disappointment into a cudgel, I did not return the call because the only answer worth giving had already been filed with the bank before noon. I did one more quiet thing before closing, a step that looks cosmetic to outsiders but matters when you are trying to close the door on a decade of being drafted into other people's narratives, because I reserved a new mark, bought a clean domain, and approved a simple front sign that would replace the family surname with a promise that fits in 4 plain words, a name that sounds like a joke until you hear it tick in your head like a metronome, because the point is not flash, but steadiness. And the point is not legacy but delivery, so I called the shop what it had secretly been since the day I took control, Plain Work Company, because when you build around plain work you sleep at night. As I pressed the order button on the sign, Quinn pinged me with an email forwarded from my sister's newly hired counsel, a message draped in polite phrases, but carrying a demand that trembled with entitlement, asking for a ceremonial title for my sister. A share of revenue to reflect so-called family equity and access to accounts for oversight, and I felt the flicker of old anger before it cooled into something colder and cleaner, and I replied with a single sentence that carried the whole architecture of my boundary inside it: no. Not because I wanted to fight, but because I refused to bargain with a story that was never true. Then I shut the laptop, locked the door, and stood for a moment in the dim light of the empty shop listening to the presses settle, thinking about how reputation gets built not by winning the loud day on the internet, but by showing up on the quiet morning after. When orders still need packing and people still need paychecks, and a grown woman can finally say with a steady voice that what she builds will never again be decided by anyone who confuses attention with authority. The next morning began not with some triumphant trumpet blast or theatrical unveiling, but with the slow, deliberate cadence of tasks that signal permanence more convincingly than any speech. Because while Quinn confirmed that the acknowledgement letter from my father's attorney included the no interference clause we had requested and Rosa set the presses for a run that would land by end of day, I walked Evan through the final version of the operating plan that tied his role to deadlines, throughput, and client satisfaction rather than to the moods of people who enjoyed performing authority, and I watched him absorb what it meant to be evaluated by results that could not be spun, which for a man who had lived too long under the improvisations of family pride felt both terrifying and strangely liberating, the kind of fear that is just competence knocking. We took the short walk to the neutral conference room where the lawyer waited with his well-worn briefcase and a face that announced resignation more than combat, and before he could reframe the last-minute settlement demand that had tried to smuggle my sister into an oversight role, I slid 2 sheets across the table and said that this was the entire menu. Nothing hidden in the kitchen and no specials coming later. Either Evan stays as operations director under a clear path to equity with milestones we will both sign in plain language, or he takes a clean buyout of a few months of salary and walks out without humiliation or debt, and in both cases the company remains free of ceremonial titles, family review panels, and revenue taps justified by nostalgia, a boundary articulated not as anger but as design. Evan read slowly, asked 2 questions that were so practical I could have hugged him, and chose to stay, signing with a steadiness that made the lawyer exhale as if a storm had finally passed to the other side of town, and the man, who had spent 2 days trying to domesticate a client who preferred shouting, gathered his papers and said he would file the acknowledgement confirming that neither my father nor my sister would assert claims to the lease, the accounts, the brand assets, or the client lists, which is the near-boring sentence I had wanted to hear from the first minute this conflict stopped being a private family ache and became a matter of record. Back at the shop, I set in motion the last sequence of quiet moves that would harden our future against the next performance. Because while Rosa coached Evan on a maintenance checklist that had been neglected for months and Quinn pushed out our referral note to the customers who actually pay for reliability over fireworks, I cued the sign installation that would replace the family name with the 4 words that had lived in my head since the night of the graduation party and felt more right. With every hour of sanity we put on the board, Plain Work Company, not a wink or a provocation, but a promise that our identity would be proof of work rather than inheritance. And as I approved the mock-up, I laughed a little at the thought that somewhere my sister was carefully drafting a caption about grace and resilience that used adjectives the way we use bolts, as if enough of them could hold together a structure built on air. In the late afternoon, my father walked in with a tentative posture that I had never seen on him, stopped at the mat like a customer who respected posted boundaries, and asked if he could sit for a minute, and, because I have no appetite for cruelty, I said yes and pointed to the chairs by the pickup counter, where he started with small talk about order volume and machine uptime and the fragile state of the local economy before finally moving to the sentence he had never said to me in his life, which was that he was sorry for making me the problem whenever I refused to play the role he had written for me, and he did not dress it up with caveats or trapdoor clauses, just laid it there like a tool he should have learned to use years ago, and I told him thank you because praise is not the only form of respect. But when he asked whether there might be an advisory role for him, perhaps a small seat where he could share wisdom and connections, I said no with a tone that did not punish, explaining that what we were building required the discipline of clean lines, and that the kindest thing we could do for each other was to let the boundary become habit rather than argument, and he nodded like a man who finally understood that conceding is not the same as disappearing. Then asked if he could come by next week when we put up the new sign, and I told him it would not be a launch, it would be a workday, and that if he wanted a shirt he was welcome to buy one at closing like any other customer, which he accepted with an exhale that sounded like relief loosening a knot he had kept tight for years. When the sign went up the following afternoon, there was no ribbon to cut and no staged photo under balloons, only a few clients picking up orders who nodded at the straightforwardness of the name, and a school fundraiser coordinator who looked around and said that something felt steadier in the room, which I filed away as the only review that mattered, while Evan looked at the letters like he had just been handed a map out of a maze, and Rosa wiped a hand across her forehead in a gesture that said more than a dozen compliments about leadership. I gave Evan a small box that held a key on a plain ring, not the set he already carried for the doors, but the one that opened the safe, and when he asked if I was scared at all of what might come next, the online jabs, the next family dinner, the sideways comments from people who prefer gossip to invoices, I told him yes in the sense that anyone who actually cares about outcomes feels adrenaline when responsibility becomes non-negotiable, but no in the way that matters, because fear is just a signal and boundaries are a plan executed one calm step after another, and then we locked up with the uncomplicated satisfaction of people who have done enough for one day and do not need a lens to prove it. That evening my phone lit with a message from my mother showing a gift bag on their kitchen table with my name on it, a few old report cards, a ring my grandmother used to wear, and a note that said she should have protected me from his pride. And I let the image sit without replying, because forgiveness is not a contract and I am done pretending that every gesture requires immediate acceptance. Then I opened the inbox and saw the final email from the lawyer confirming signatures on the no interference clause, the accountant's confirmation that the education fund timeline was copied to all parties and archived, and the landlord's cheerful welcome to Plain Work Company for the next stretch of years, which stacked together like bricks into the foundation I had wanted since I first learned that being quiet at a table does not mean being powerless, it means keeping your hands free to hold the keys.